Kentucky, and I would just make a couple of observations. Earlier, one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I don't recall who, said that there's not enough time in the day. It might have been a gentlelady from Pennsylvania, I'm not sure. That not enough time in the day for Congress to weigh in effectively on each and every regulation. And I would just ask the gentlelady from Wyoming if she sees in that statement an acknowledgement of the problem. That we have, in fact, a bureaucratic state that is engaged in so many regulations that the people's representatives are unable to actually, in the words of my colleague on the other side of the aisle, although I disagree with the assertion that we're unable to deal with it, she would suggest that there was not enough time in the day to weigh in on all the regulations. Isn't that an admission that there's so many regulations going on by the bureaucratic, unelected administrative state, that that's a problem, and that reclaiming that power back into the people's house and the Article 1 Congress is actually paramount?
I would absolutely agree with it, and I would add to it that there is a cost to these regulations. And in 2021, that regulatory cost was $2 trillion. So it's not only that there are way too many regulations, with well over 3,000 being adopted every year, it's a $2 trillion hidden tax that every single one of us pay. It's about $14,900 per household in additional expense associated with the regulatory burden in this country that is, again, a hidden tax that is caused by unelected bureaucrats that nobody said, please, as Mr. Massey has said, please go adopt another regulation limiting my ability to choose which car I want to drive.
Well, another statistic that was raised with this, that this would apply to something in the zip code of 100 regulations a year, assuming that that is the number of regulations that would qualify under the $100 million economic impact. I don't know if that's an exact stat, but that's still a fairly astounding, significantly large number of regulations that would apply, 100 regulations a year. And I just would wonder if the gentlelady would have comment on that point and about the bureaucratic state and how that speaks to it. And then secondly, how you would, the gentlelady had referenced the extent to which our states and localities engage in an enormous amount of their own regulatory power and the police powers that are granted to them under the Constitution, or I guess recognized in them under the Constitution, whether it's Wyoming or Texas, our own TCEQ, right, our Council on Environmental Quality, and our own Clean Air, Clean Water Acts, which predated the federal. I wonder if the gentlelady could speak to that as well.
Well, that's exactly right. That's what so many people fail to understand, is that the states also have an array of regulations and statutes in place as well. So what has happened is that the federal government has attempted to expand its power, and most specifically the executive branch, through the regulatory regime that we're talking about here. So what has happened with the EPA, for example, I would argue that the EPA has become increasingly prosecutorial rather than regulatory in some of the things that they have done. So they've gone out and, for example, determined that someone who moved an irrigation ditch should have had a 404 permit, and for that reason, under the Clean Water Act, bring an enforcement action against him, and the guy's facing penalties of $65 million for affecting 2.1 acres of land on his own property. Those are the kinds of things that these agencies do. The gentleman from Kentucky was alluding to that there are criminal penalties associated with these regulations, and yet there's absolutely no legislative oversight. So you have not only the federal regulations, you have the state regulations, as you're talking about, and typically it's the states that are carrying out most of these regulations because, again, you've got your people here in Washington, D.C., but they're not out in the field doing it, whether it's the Department of Transportation or whatever it may be. But again, I think that it's very important for people to understand that the states also have a regulatory regime that is in addition to the federal regulatory regime.
One other question that's been raised is the extent to which allegedly it's a problem that the CRA has only been used 20 odd times over a certain period of time. I don't remember the exact stat. But doesn't that miss the core point of the REINS Act? And that the CRA is basically a construct that allows an undo, right? It allows Congress to step in and say, whoa, 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 what are you doing with this regulation? We'd like to insert ourselves, but you can only do that within, I can't remember the exact number, 90 legislative days?
Yeah.
So you have 90 legislative days. So in truth, the CRA is really only applicable when you have a transfer of power in the White House with usually a House that has or a Congress that has a different party in control, right? So the CRA has a very, very limited function, very limited ability to actually serve as a check on the regulatory state. Isn't that the real reason why it's been used so few times?
Well, it's been used so few times, but it's been successful so few times. And again, the example being that it is that the current House is controlled by Republicans, the Senate is controlled by Democrats, yet even during the 118th Congress, I identified 3 different circumstances where there was bicameral support to overturn 3 different regulations issued by this administration, and the president vetoed every one of them. So the CRA cannot work when you've got a president who's passing the regulations, even when his own party may be opposed to the regulations that he's attempting to pass. So we've got WOTUS, the tariff repeal on solar panels, and the ESG requirements. Both the House, Republican House, Democrat Senate, we used the CRA.
Right.
And we said, we don't like this regulation. That's the way Article 1, Section 1 is supposed to work. Yet even under that circumstance, the president, because these regulations are so often political, not for the purpose for which they are put forth, they are political statements, you can't even get a CRA through.
And notable, right, that the CRA was in fact used and then signed by the president with respect to a issue involving the District of Columbia, because not as directly political, but because I can punt that to D.C. But here, the president's standing in the way, in the will of Congress, which I think undermines, by the way, the whole presentment question, right? The whole
Yes.
Chadha issue. Because the fact is, with the REINS Act, it actually reverses that. It empowers Congress. It empowers Congress significantly more. Because instead of having to step in and undo a regulation, and only undo that regulation in the beginning of the next Congress, where you've got maybe 90 legislative days to do it, you have the REINS Act where you're able to go say, well, wait a second. If there's a regulation that's problematic and Congress thinks there's an issue with it, then Congress can act, because Congress will have to say yes or no to said regulation and then present it to the President of the United States. So in fact, you have the opposite of a presentment problem. You have a legitimate exercise of power by Congress saying, wait a second, that regulatory state, when you have that kind of an impact, Congress should have a voice. Is that not all correct?
Absolutely.
From Wyoming?
Absolutely, that's correct. And what's interesting about it is that when I referenced the roadless rule earlier, Congress was very concerned about what the roadless rule would do in terms of our ability to control forest fires and address pine beetle outbreak and those kinds of things. But the only option that they really had was to go to the GAO and ask the GAO to force the Forest Service to start issuing reports about what the environmental impact of that rule would be. So you've got a circumstance where Republican and Democrats both are looking at this massive regulation, which at the time was the largest rulemaking in U.S. history. They're looking at this massive regulation, and they're all saying, we don't think that this is a good idea. And they almost had no mechanism at all other than to study it for them to actually block it. And they ultimately couldn't do that, but they did issue the reports talking about the environmental degradation that the rule would have.
Oh, go ahead.
And I recently questioned the head of the Forest Service and got him to admit that the roadless rule did exactly what we said it was going to do, which has been environmentally devastating to the interior West.
Well, I wonder if the gentlelady will just bear with me for a minute and see if she agrees. We're talking about the importance of these things. For example, WOTUS. In January of 2023, EPA and Army Corps issued new WOTUS rules that trample property rights and subject farmers, ranchers, and businesses to the whims of bureaucrats. And as a reminder, in 2016, the EPA imprisoned 77-year-old Navy veteran Joe Robertson for 18 months for building ponds on his remote Montana property to fight forest fires. The gentlelady familiar with that, with a state that's really proximate to your home state.
Yes.
Coal. In March of 2023, the EPA finalized a, quote, good neighbor plan to regulate power plant ozone that would eliminate half of Texas' coal-fired generation fleet in just a few years. Meanwhile, this summer in Texas, we will see more demand for electricity than can be met with our dispatchable generation capacity alone. Yet this is done by administrative fiat, not by anybody elected, not by anybody checking that. It's being done by administrative bureaucrats. EPA proposed rules that would force 2/3 of the new vehicles sold in the United States to be electric by 2032. Now, first of all, the plumber hanging out in San Marcos, Texas, or somewhere in a small town anywhere in America or in Wyoming, do you think that the individual working right now is saying, oh boy, may I please have an electric vehicle that's going to cost 2 or 3, 4 times as much, or I'm going to have to plug in and use as much electricity as an air conditioning unit in powering up my house, the same amount of electricity to charge up that battery-powered vehicle, and then wonder if I can get from one side of Wyoming to the other, or wonder whether I can get from my place in Austin out to, say, Midland through the state of West Texas? But somewhere in some study group or focus group in the bowels of Harvard, this seems like a great idea. But we've got a bunch of bureaucrats from the bowels of Harvard or wherever they're from, sitting over in administrative agencies, deciding what that plumber in Texas or what that individual in Wyoming gets to do. How about the fact that the grid, the EPA proposed a rule to force power plants to cut their emissions by an unachievable 90% between 2035 and 2040, or otherwise shut down. The EIA estimates that the Inflation Reduction Act, so-called, could make wind and solar account for nearly 60% of U.S. electricity generation by 2050. Wind and solar make up just 12% of U.S. generation. Those are related because despite that being legislation that was passed last August, you have the EPA proposing rules that, when joined with it, cripple. I just want to be very clear to every American out there, cripples your ability to have a reliable grid or one that you can afford. How about loans? Biden's $500 billion student loan bailout is forcing a veteran to subsidize his neighbor's master's degree despite actually sacrificing for the United States. Right now, we got almost $500 billion by executive fiat, which the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, acknowledged the president did not have the power to do. And yet here we sit saying, shouldn't Congress have the, not just the power, but the duty to check a regulation like that sent to us from the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, or better stated, from the alphabet soup of agencies between here and there? How about the ATF's pistol brace rule that just went into effect last week? Millions of Americans sitting out there today are felons for buying a constitutionally protected product and having a plastic attachment attached to it. That's the truth. They are punishable up to 10 years in prison and thousands of dollars of fines because they have a product that was legal when they bought it, attached to a constitutionally protected weapon, and they are now going to be subject to possibly being a felon. How? Did Congress vote on that? The gentlelady, did the Congress vote on any of these things I'm talking about?
No.
Or were these all done by administrative executive fiat?
Exactly. All done by administrative agencies.
How about vaccines? The CMS vaccine mandate rule continues to force 10.4 million healthcare workers in this country to take a needle in their arm or lose their job. Remember OSHA? Remember the administration tried to implement an OSHA rule to force 84 million Americans to take a vaccine? Thankfully, the court struck it down. But where was Congress? Nowhere, because the executive branch could use administrative, executive fiat to make decisions. This is precisely why we have separation of powers. It's precisely why we're supposed to execute on the separation of powers. And it is precisely why the REIN Act is so critically important. I assume the gentlelady would agree.
Yes, I do.
So one or two other quick questions. I would just say maybe to the gentleman, Mr. Johnson, gentleman from Georgia. Am I correct that in the recent debt ceiling bill that was passed last week, passed by the Senate, I guess late last week, that in that bill there was some sort of administrative pay-go regulatory language that was inserted into the debt ceiling bill?
No, it was not.
Was not? I think there was supposed to be, there was administrative pay-go language, that is, that requiring the administration to go through the process of saying if a regulation had a certain impact, right, that they would have to then go figure out how to pay for that impact on the fly, like administrative pay-go. But my point of bringing that question up, which that is in the debt ceiling bill, is it is also waivable, right? I believe that in the debt ceiling bill, that language which was inserted into the bill is fully waivable by the OMB director. Does the gentleman from Georgia believe that to be true?
I think you may know a little bit more about it. You voted against it.
Well, I would hope those who voted for it know a lot about it more than those who voted against it, to be honest with you.
Well, you're in a position to educate us, but that is not our topic here today.
Oh, well, I would take issue with that and
So-
allow the gentleman to expand on it. It is precisely the topic because we passed the REINS Act as part of the debt ceiling package, Limit, Save, Grow, in late April. And in that REINS Act, we would have been able to constrain the Biden administration. However, last week, the debt ceiling, quote, deal, unquote, was cut. And Democrats at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue demanded that we take out the REINS Act and insert instead administrative pay-go, which is, to the best of my understanding, fully waivable. And in fact, fully waivable, such that the OMB director, Shalonda Young, said she would waive it if, quote, deemed necessary to make sure President Biden's agenda is carried forward, end quote. I think my question was going to just simply be, why would it need to be waived? That'd be my question, but I'm not sure that the gentleman's expert on this subject. And so I'd just say to the gentlelady from Wyoming, why would you think it would need to be waived?
Well, I wouldn't think it would ever need to be waived. But
Right.
they're going to waive it because they're going to continue with an agenda that is crushing the economy and crushing our middle class and violating our Constitution.
Which is precisely the reason why we included the REINS Act in the debt ceiling bill to start with, because we knew full well the administration would, of course, waive any kind of provision that is waivable. By her own admission, she said that she would waive it. Thus is the state of things in the swamp. The swamp often wins when presented with a choice. The swamp is going to choose the thing that's going to continue to perpetuate the swamp. So therein lies the problem with that particular question. The second question is the student loan payoffs. I think it is correct, and I'd ask the gentleman from Georgia, that the student loan bailout provision, the provisions that are almost $500 billion, that those provisions that were removed from being in place under the debt ceiling bill that this House passed out in late April, that was removed at the demand of the White House and the acquiescence of the House. That was removed from the debt ceiling bill last week. Does the gentleman agree that the bailout for student loans is no longer in the debt ceiling bill?
I'm not going to get into a discussion about the debt ceiling. That was a victory for the American people. It's something that has been passed, signed into law. I voted for it. You voted against it. You've got a axe to grind about it, and I can appreciate the fact that you would use this opportunity to do so. But I'm not in the position to engage you on that issue in this hearing.
So the reason that I raised the question is not to dwell or refocus on the absurdity of the debt deal that was cut last week. It is rather to raise the point that you have an executive branch that made an executive decision, an administrative action, unlawfully, by the way.
An executive
that
order is
was-
different from an administrative.
You had action
Rule
by the
promulgation.
executive branch. You had action by the executive branch.
That's
Carried
not the
out.
same as a
Carried out.
as a regulation issued by a federal agency, and that's what we're talking about today.
You have the executive branch carrying out by fiat from the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue through its agencies, enforced through its agencies, and through the rulemaking authority. You have them going through the process of canceling, getting rid of, forgiving, providing a bailout, whatever words we want to use, for almost $500 billion worth of student loans.
Congress has authorized the administration to do that.
So herein lies the great question. Herein lies the whole point. Who decides? And in this case, what we're saying is that bureaucrats and the executive branch decide without Congress speaking to the actual spending of $500 billion. And when we did speak to it, we pull it out, it's not there, and here we sit. And all we're trying to say is, in this bill, in the REINS Act, which should have been passed last week in the debt ceiling bill, along with the student loan cancellation repeal, but neither were. And so now what we're saying is, can we at least protect against future abuse by the executive branch to say, hey, let's pass this bill, a bill which we all firmly expect not to pass the Senate, by the way, so it therefore becomes a messaging bill rather than using the debt ceiling to actually get it done, side note. But Cannot we just pass this piece of legislation to say to the executive branch, hey, maybe you should have to come to Congress before you act, before you go blow $500 billion in direct unfairness to the 87% of Americans who do not have student loans or those who never took out student loans. The gentlelady from Wyoming agree with that point.
Well, I agree, absolutely. There is no circumstance under our Constitution where an executive branch by executive order or regulation should be able to adopt something that would have an impact of $500 billion without coming to Congress. It's absolutely unconstitutional.
There's a litany of other issues that I could put into the record, and I won't, but there's amendments that we'll be having that we're offering that deal with a whole lot of issues that don't necessarily get absorbed into the $100 million economic impact, or at least obviously, that I think are important to make sure we address, and we'll address those on the floor. But just to close, under no circumstances should the People's House be turning over the ability to make decisions on these important matters to unelected bureaucrats that have no check in our separation of powers in our system of government. With that, I would yield back my time.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Indiana.